Well, good afternoon from Canberra to wherever you may be, and welcome to this ASPI webinar on the road from 9/11, the evolution of counter-terrorism and extremism. I'm Peter Jennings, Executive Director of ASPI. Over the weekend, we've witnessed the moving ceremonies commemorating the thousands who lost their lives in the Al-Qaeda attacks 20 years ago now on the World Trade Center and on the Pentagon, and the tragic loss of United Airlines Flight 93 in Pennsylvania. And of course, the 20th anniversary of those events has been irrevocably tied to the Taliban's return to power in Kabul at the end of August. To discuss the impact of these events and participate in some discussions with me, and then after he departs the meeting, after the Minister departs the meeting, I will introduce our brilliant panel to focus on the evolution of counter-terrorism and extremism. I'm delighted that the Honourable Karen Andrews MP, the Minister for Home Affairs, is joining us. And now to introduce the Minister. After a career as an engineer and running her own industrial relations business, Karen Andrews was elected to the Parliament in 2010 as the Federal Minister for Macpherson on the Gold Coast. Karen has been Assistant Minister for Vocational Education and Skills and Assistant Minister for Science. She was sworn in as Minister for Industry, Science and Technology in the Morrison Cabinet in August of 2018. And on the 30th of March 2021, Minister Andrews became the first ever female Minister for Home Affairs, with portfolio responsibilities for Australia's domestic security and law enforcement agencies, cybersecurity, counter-terrorism, counter-espionage and foreign interference, counter-child sexual exploitation, and also preparation for the gradual reopening of Australia's international borders. Karen, thank you very much for taking the time to join with us today. The floor is yours to make an opening statement.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you, even if we could only meet virtually today. Now, I'd like to thank ASPI and Peter Jennings, of course, for the very kind invitation to address this important forum. Thank you. 20 years ago, we saw terrorist attacks in the United States that claimed 2,977 innocent lives, including those of 10 Australians. Today, we remember those 2,977 victims. Although 2 decades have passed, we have not forgotten. So too, we remember the survivors, many of whom suffered physical, emotional, or psychological harm that still follows them through the years. As Minister responsible for the Australian Federal Police, I'm acutely aware of the danger that many first responders rushed into that day. In doing so, many were killed, and even more have lived with a significant trauma ever since. Of course, one didn't need to be present to feel the gut-wrenching horror of that day. Images beamed around the world had a profound impact on the psyche of many people, some of whom no longer felt safe in their own homes and workplaces, or who were shocked at the wounds inflicted on so iconic a skyline. 20 years ago, with the Taliban harbouring Al-Qaeda in the tunnels of Tora Bora, the United States and Australia were drawn into conflict in Afghanistan. 2 decades later, we have only just departed. We should therefore reflect on an entire generation that has come of age not knowing any other world. As a case in point, of the 13 US service members killed in the recent terrorist attacks at Kabul airport, 12 were in their 20s and 5 of them were just 20 years old. Newborns on September 11, 2001. Their lives would be indelibly marked by the events of that day, highlighting in sadness the long shadow such events can cast. Standing alongside those US servicemen and women for the past 20 years were almost 39,000 Australian Defence Force personnel. I pay tribute to them all for their service and their sacrifice. None more so than the 41 Australians who lost their lives in service of our country. As the Prime Minister has said, your actions meant Afghanistan was not a haven for Al-Qaeda. You diminished Al-Qaeda's ability to launch sophisticated attacks on the West, and you wiped out a generation of terrorist leaders. I'm also grateful for the service of the men and women of our security and intelligence agencies. You have served with purpose and seen many successes. As much as it shocked all decent people, the 9/11 attacks have, sadly, served as inspiration for new generations of extremists. From religiously motivated extremists seeking to replicate the attacks, to other ideologically motivated extremists exporting hate and calling for vengeance. For the last 20 years, and of course even earlier too, our security and intelligence agencies have been on the front line, dealing with radicals and extremists and foiling their attempted attacks, often by putting themselves into significant danger. Today's discussion is titled The Road from 9/11. And over 20 years, it's been a long road. We could view it as a road that started in New York, the Pentagon, and in a field in Pennsylvania. A road that cut a path through the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of Iraq. Brought us to a nightclub in Bali, a cafe in Sydney, a police station in Parramatta, and a mosque in Christchurch. Perhaps it's a road that looks like London Bridge, Burke Street, a promenade in Nice, or the end of a marathon in Boston, and that's just to name a few. That's only one side of the story though, and it would be wrong and counterproductive to focus on it. Terrorists thrive on attention, so I will speak no more of their atrocities. Rather, Australia's road from 9/11 has seen us come together as a nation, uniting in condemnation of terrorists and with a firm commitment to keep each other safe. Thankfully, in Australia, we have so far avoided a mass casualty attack of the type the United States experienced that day. This has not been by accident, it's not been luck. And it's not because we haven't continued to be a target. As we saw in Sydney in 2005, at the Holsworthy Barracks in 2009, or at Sydney International Airport in 2017. Rather, it's because we have, over many years, taken the threat seriously. It's because of the hard-working men and women of our law enforcement and security agencies, many of whom saw the events of 9/11 and at that moment committed themselves to safeguarding their fellows, saying never again and not on my watch. And it's because here in Australia, we have consciously based our counter-terrorism responses around 3 pillars. These 3 pillars have guided our response over the past 20 years and will continue to do so over the next 20. They are: Pillar 1, ensuring our counter-terrorism arrangements are seamless, collaborative, and uniform within, across, and between jurisdictions. Pillar 2, acknowledging that terrorism exists on a continuum of behaviour and that by countering violent extremism in all its forms, we can de-radicalise some individuals before an attack takes place. And Pillar 3, a solemn commitment to supporting our intelligence, law enforcement and other operational agencies, making sure they have the resources, powers and legislative backing they need to tackle the most dangerous of individuals and threats. These pillars have kept us safe from a mass casualty attack, but they are no panacea. Terrorism is a real and enduring threat to Australians, to our way of life and to our national social cohesion. We cannot be complacent. The national terrorism threat level remains at probable, where it has been since 2014. Individuals, groups, and ideologies, both old and new, continue to plot and fantasise about doing us harm. Encrypted communications and global digital networks give these people a secure voice to a worldwide audience. Disruption associated with the pandemic has seen many stay home alone with little to do but search the internet for simple answers to complex global questions. And recent changes in the geopolitical paradigm in the Middle East has seen Afghanistan once again emerge as a potential safe haven for radical Islamist groups and networks. As Australia's national plans sees us emerge from prolonged lockdowns, we'll once again start to gather in crowds. Sporting arenas, shopping malls, airports, and other iconic locations will once more need to contend with the spectre of terrorism. Now, I don't say this to scaremonger, rather to ensure we're clear-eyed about the threat, so we can prepare now to safeguard all Australians from those who would do us harm. In the wake of the September 11 attacks, then Prime Minister John Howard, who was in Washington, DC at that time, knew immediately he was dealing with a problem the Commonwealth could not face alone. A sophisticated terrorist network, well-resourced and with a global reach, had successfully evaded the security agencies of the world's only superpower. That's why, long before the US's own 9/11 Commission report reached the same conclusion, the Australian government took decisive action to increase collaboration. The Commonwealth immediately spearheaded an initiative to join with the premiers and chief ministers of the states and territories to establish new counter-terrorism arrangements. Through an intergovernmental agreement, the National Counter-Terrorism Committee was launched. This new structure ensured cooperation between the Commonwealth, state and territory governments and their respective operational agencies, including police and Commonwealth intelligence services. The architecture was sound and so successful that a decade later it reached across the Tasman to become the Australia-New Zealand Counter-Terrorism Committee, known as the ANZ CTC. This structure of seamless cooperation across jurisdictions has proven to be a key component of Australia's counter-terrorism response, and it's one I'm committed to continuing. While we have been justifiably focused on responding to the COVID pandemic, we can't take our eyes off the terrorist threat. That's why I can announce today that I have invited Australia's police and law enforcement ministers to a joint meeting to discuss the continued threat of terrorist attack in this country. Fueled by the dark web, religiously motivated and ideologically motivated individuals and groups here in Australia do mean us harm and are planning acts of violence. The changing situation in Afghanistan presents a serious concern. With the Taliban in control, Afghanistan may once again become an international safe haven for terrorist networks and cells. And the very anniversary we are discussing today, perversely, serves as inspiration for some. Given these significant developments, the time is right for ministers to gather and ensure we are all taking the steps needed to protect Australians. The safety and security of our citizens is a responsibility for all elected representatives, Commonwealth, state and territory. I look forward to discussing with my counterparts how we can all continue in the strong collaborative vein Prime Minister Howard started. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the world's focus was, rightly, the degradation and destruction of large-scale, sophisticated terrorist networks, most notably Al-Qaeda. Over time, our successful responses and those of our allies and partners reduced the threat of a direct attack from that group. As an example, we saw in 2006 the disruption of Al-Qaeda's transatlantic liquid bomb attack, a plot foiled by British police to bring down airliners using explosives disguised as soft drinks. However, the murderous ideology that drove them served as an inspiration for others. The Bali bombing and the rise of Jemaah Islamiyah in our near region served as an early example. But these reverberations continued to echo across the globe, as we saw with the rise of the so-called Islamic State. That group's territorial gains, coupled with unchecked online propaganda, saw 230 Australians travel to conflict zones in the Middle East, changing the terrorism threat environment from 2014. It was no longer enough to target committed terrorists themselves. We needed to address radicalisation and violent extremism before it manifested in an attack. This is an effort that continues to this day. With little to no warning, a lone actor with a knife and smartphone can cause shockwaves around the world. In 2021, ASIO assesses that such lone actor attacks are the most likely form of terrorism we will experience in Australia. Tragically, just a fortnight ago, we saw a committed ISIS-inspired extremist attack, 7 innocent people in a shopping centre in Auckland. Thankfully, New Zealand police were able to respond quickly and professionally. But as we emerge from the pandemic and once more gather together, this is a threat we will continue to face. Countering violent extremism, or CVE, is therefore a core element of our CT response. Since 2014, it has placed Australia's response to terrorism within the wider context of our overall social cohesion. As a government, we are committed to addressing the full spectrum of extremist threats, regardless of political, religious, social, cultural, or issue-specific ideology. Our CVE initiatives address terrorist and extremist violence by intervening early with a range of vulnerable communities and at-risk individuals, both before and after they face a court or a prison sentence. The need for such a program has never been clearer. Since September 2014, when the national terrorism threat level was raised, 140 people have been charged as a result of 67 counter-terrorism related operations around Australia. There have been 9 attacks and 21 major disruption operations. And you may recall one very serious plot in 2017 when 2 brothers in Sydney failed to smuggle an improvised explosive device onto an international airliner. They also planned to create a device that could disperse deadly chemicals in a crowded area, reminiscent of the Shinriko attack on the Tokyo subway in 1995. Thankfully, good work by the Australian Federal Police, ASIO, the New South Wales Police and others, including international partners, saw the brothers arrested before they could hurt anyone, and both are now serving lengthy jail terms. Coupled with efforts to de-radicalise such individuals, we must also harden our defences against those we can't bring back from the brink. Which brings me to the third pillar of Australia's response to terrorism. Terrorists seek to create fear and division in our communities. Their ultimate aim is to destroy the ties that bind us together as a nation. That's why there is no greater refutation of their ideology, nor proof of their impotence, than the free, open and transparent debate that empowers our liberal democratic norms. The act of passing legislation through a parliament elected by the Australian people and reflective of their diversity is a direct challenge to terrorist ideology. It's also emblematic of our adherence to the rule of law, a concept alien to terrorists who kill indiscriminately. Since the national terrorism threat level was raised to probable in 2014, the Parliament has passed 22 tranches of legislation to strengthen Australia's counter-terrorism response and support our operational agencies. As a recent example, I was pleased to join with Minister Cash to pass the Counter-Terrorism Legislation Amendment, Sunsetting Review and Other Measures Bill. This provides for the continuation of key counter-terrorism powers, including control orders and preventative detention orders, powers that are critical for the operational agencies who are on the ground managing these serious threats. And we know that there is more to do. As we recently saw in Auckland, some individuals are so committed to doing us harm, they cannot be de-radicalised. And as we witnessed in the 2019 London Bridge and 2020 Streatham attacks in the United Kingdom, convicted terrorist offenders can pose a very real threat to the community at the conclusion of their sentence. In the case of the Streatham attack, it occurred in the mere days following the offender's release from prison. In Australia, there are 51 offenders serving jail sentences for terrorist offences and another 32 before the courts, with several of these offenders reaching the conclusion of their prison sentences in the next few years. The need for effective risk management measures to keep our community safe is greater than ever. It will be an important focus of mine. The government currently has before the Parliament the Counter-Terrorism legislation amendment, High Risk Terrorist Offenders Bill 2020. The bill will create a new extended supervision order scheme to assist our agencies keep the community safe when high-risk terrorist offenders are released into the community after serving their sentence. Currently, I, as Minister for Home Affairs, can seek from the court a continuing detention order. Such an order allows for the continuing detention of eligible convicted terrorist offenders who pose an unacceptable risk of committing a serious terrorism offence if released into the community. It, of course, comes with high thresholds under the law. Under the bill before Parliament, a Minister for Home Affairs will be able to apply for a new category of order, an extended supervision order. Such an order will allow courts to impose tailored supervisory conditions specific to the risk posed by the terrorist offender if released into the community, where the court is not satisfied that continuing detention is appropriate to prevent that risk. The bill will broaden the range of tools available to address the risk posed by convicted terrorist offenders and give our agencies the authorities and the information they need to keep Australians safe. It's not easy to ask someone to put themselves in harm's way, to watch over, interact with, or arrest a person who we know is planning to do us violence. It's even harder to actually do it. To those we ask of that, I say, this government has your back. This government will continue to seek passage through the Parliament of the powers you need and the resources required to do your job. Similarly, the rule of law is a concept that should apply online as it does offline. In May this year, I was proud to represent Australia in a meeting of the Christchurch Call to Action, alongside New Zealand Prime Minister Ardern and French President Macron. The call is a commitment by governments and tech companies to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online, and is something I will continue to prioritise. I won't allow digital spaces to become safe havens for terrorists, nor allow encrypted communications to protect the anonymity of those who would do us harm. That's why I was very pleased recently to secure passage of the Surveillance Legislation Amendment, Identify and Disrupt Bill, giving the AFP and the ACIC important new powers to tackle crime and extremists on the dark web. The terrorist threat will continue to evolve, and terrorists will continue to take advantage of events both here and right around the world. I'm in regular contact with my counterparts overseas and will shortly embark on a series of important international engagements with Five Eyes and Indonesian counterparts among them. 20 years after 9/11, terrorism remains a significant global threat. The three pillars we've built our response on for the last 20 years have served us well and will continue to do so going forward. We will continue to secure Australia and the freedom that security affords us by collaborating with others, sharing experiences and working together. We will continue to counter violent extremism in all its forms before an attack takes place, maintaining our social cohesion and celebrating diversity and inclusion, where terrorists try to divide and sow fear. And we will continue to give our law enforcement and security agencies the powers and authorities they need to respond to the terrorists and violent extremists who would do us harm. The road from 9/11 has not reached its end. It never will. It is a road that will continue to wind and turn. We may yet see some familiar faces, some familiar places along the way, and there will no doubt be fresh challenges ahead. But over the past 20 years, the overwhelming majority of Australians have come together to reject terrorist ideologies. We've kept each other safe from mass casualty attacks, and we've built a strong framework for managing the threat. I have full confidence that the next 20 years will only see more of the same. Thank you.
Karen, thank you so much for that presentation. Let me ask you, if I may, a few questions. I noticed you touched in a number of places in your speech on the international agenda for counter-terrorism cooperation, the Five Eyes connections, the particular relationship that Australia has with Indonesia. What, in your view, is the agenda for counter-terrorism cooperation in Australia's immediate region?
Look, thank you for that. Look, it's very clear that countering terrorism is a key priority for our Five Eyes partners. I've also, and I have met a number of times now with my counterparts. I have also met recently virtually with my counterparts in Malaysia and the Philippines, and will continue to work with them and our nearest neighbours, particularly Indonesia. We're all aware that the threat of terrorism has not diminished, that it will continue. We are all alert to the risks that it imposes to our particular way of life. Now, we are engaging with our nearest neighbours in particular through a range of forums. One of those is the sub-regional meeting on counter-terrorism and transnational security. So I co-chair that with Indonesia, and I'll be looking forward to our next meeting, which at this stage is due to take place next year. So clearly the issues of not only transnational serious and organised crime, but particularly for the purposes of today, counter-terrorism are key priorities for Australia, for its neighbours, and for the Five Eyes.
Karen, on that long and unfinished road that is the counter-terrorism road, a curve none of us were expecting was COVID. Do you think COVID spurs radicalisation? What impact has COVID had on the counter-terrorism agenda?
COVID provided an opportunity. So we know that pre-COVID, there were many people, far too many people, who were online. They were accessing material that they clearly should not have been accessing. But it's information that is available not just on the dark web, but also on the clear web. What we know is that during COVID, many more people have the opportunity to be at home and have spent increasing amounts of time online. So we know that the risk has escalated. We know that radicalisation has increased. So we are very alert to what the consequences of that may be as we come out of COVID, as we start to move more freely around our community, as there are larger gatherings of people, as people are able to travel internationally. So COVID has certainly provided an opportunity to those people who were thinking of doing us harm to be able to educate themselves and find ways to actually commit the atrocities that at one stage were only just in their mind. So we are alert to that and to that risk through the federal government. And we have committed some significant funding to deal with those issues. So we have actually invested, really since now 2013, significant amounts of money, in fact more than $69 million, to support programs to actually counter violent extremism in Australia. We will continue to act because we are fully aware that if we actually can act before these people become radicalised, then there is a chance that they won't be. So we will continue as a government to invest into that, but we are, and I can assure all Australians, we are very alert to the risk that is posed by the radicalisation that we know has taken place during the COVID pandemic.
Karen, I'd like to sneak in one last question, if I may, before you have to go, and it in part plays on a number of questions that have been put to us by our audience. You mentioned 22 tranches of legislation, all of which is really designed to try to protect the Australian way of life. What are your thoughts about how to balance those the imperatives of managing an appropriate counter-terrorism regime, giving our security agencies the powers that they need against the civil liberties of Australians, and clearly protecting those very values that we're seeking here to defend. I'm conscious that this is always a challenging balance for governments to strike, but what are your thoughts about how you approach that as Minister?
Look, getting that balance right is something that successive governments, quite frankly, have grappled with for many years. As the Home Affairs Minister, my priority is national security. So I take my advice from ASIO and other intelligence agencies about the tools and the resources that they need to be able to do their job. Now, I'm fully aware that many businesses have found issues with encryption and other issues particularly difficult to manage. And I understand that there are individuals that perceive that this is Big Brother watching them and there are way too many powers already for government. But the reality is that there are people out there who want to do us harm. And I don't want that on my conscience. So I'm very comfortable in working with our intelligence agencies and our law enforcement agencies and doing all that I possibly can to make sure that they have the resources to be able to do the jobs that we need them to do so that we can be safe here in Australia.
Well, Minister Andrews, I'd like to thank you for spending some time with us today, for giving us such a considered speech. And on behalf of all of us, your audience here today, the ASPI team, can I wish you the best of luck in this vitally important work. And again, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, colleagues, we'll now move on to the rest of our discussion, which is going to be a panel discussion involving a number of leaders in the field. Roger Noble. Roger was appointed as Australia's ambassador for counter-terrorism in February 2021. He's responsible for leading Australia's international engagement on counter-terrorism, representing Australia at bilateral, regional and multilateral forums. Roger has had a distinguished military career, most recently serving as a Major General and Head of Military Strategic Commitments at the Australian Defence Force Headquarters. Previous senior defence roles include Deputy Chief of Joint Operations, deployments to Iraq as Deputy Coalition Land Force Commander, and to Afghanistan with the International Security Assistance Force. Roger was also seconded to the United States Army Pacific as Deputy Commanding General. We also have with us Dr. Raihan Ismail. She is an ARC DECRA Fellow and a Senior Lecturer at the Centre for Arab and Islamic Studies at the ANU. She was co-recipient of the Max Crawford Medal in 2018, awarded by the Australian Academy of the Humanities for outstanding achievement in the humanities by an early career scholar. Her research interests include political Islam, sectarianism, and the intertwining nature of religion and politics in the Middle East. And Katja Theodorakis. Katja is head of ASPI's Counter-Terrorism program, a recent recruit. Great to have you on the team, Katja. Before joining ASPI a few months ago, she was Senior Program Coordinator for Research and Analysis in Foreign and Security Policy at the Konrad Adenauer Foundation's Australian office. Katja has lived in the Middle East, where she engaged in educational projects and NGO work in Syria during the early years of Bashar al-Assad's presidency. Thank you all for joining us. It's great to see you today. My first question to the three of you is to ask you just quickly if you can share with us what you see as being the key issues for counter-terrorism over the next few years. Please, a couple of minutes from each of you, and I'll start with you, Roger.
Hey, g'day everybody. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Hey, I think this is based on talking to lots of our partners and analysis of what's happening. Probably the most important thing to do looking ahead rather than backwards is we've got to deal with the digital world. It's the big banner thing. Principally, online proliferation of violent extremism. I'd say most of our bilateral partners and multilaterally are struggling with that. And you could have you can draw a line between the attack in New Zealand in the supermarket and what happened in Afghanistan, for example, in terms of a narrative and a connecting global messaging that's operating. So and how do you counter that, prevent it, and control it? And there's no easy answer to any of those things. And it's probably number one, I think. Behind that is the digital world and what it means for terrorism and counterterrorism. So, encryption, for example, digital financing. How does the business of terrorism and counterterrorism evolve in the next 10 years in that framework? And then the second point I'd make is, and the minister made it actually, there's a pressing need to keep trying to prevent and counter violent extremism. And the question is what works and what works best in each context, because we know whilst there are common effective tools, it's very local. So sharing that business of what works and then modernising it so it works in the digital world as well as the real world, that's probably our big collaborative area to try and damp down on what unfortunately we've concluded is, and I don't think anyone would argue, terrorism's a persistent threat, which means it's going to keep going. And it's dynamic, so it keeps changing. So we see different versions of old ideas, and then we see new ideas and new manifestations appearing. So
the road that never ends, Roger. The road that never ends, as the minister said. Raihan, what are your thoughts about the sort of immediate agenda? And your...
Sorry, I'm trying to mute myself. Well, thank you so much, Peter. And also thank you to ASPI for inviting me today. I would perhaps look at what most scholars and policymakers who work on countering and preventing violent extremism note. And it seems that terrorist groups have failed to launch massive scale attacks in the West in the last few years, as the minister mentioned earlier. And often, they attribute this success to government spending money and human resources on intelligence agencies and law enforcement to foil plots, as well as disrupt terror networks. However, I would say that despite the fact that we have become more adept at preventing terror attacks in the West, we haven't really tackled the root causes of violent extremism. And I think this is something that is important for us to look at as well in the next few years when we're trying to understand and prevent violent extremism. And I will note 3 areas where I think it's probably crucial. First, the instability in some parts of the Middle East and outer regions that will continue to allow extremist groups to mobilize. And I think the minister mentioned that earlier. Conflict areas act as a shield for Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And there are reports showing that ISIS increasing attacks in Iraq and Syria due to ongoing security issues. The second issue I would mention as well is perhaps, and this is something, these are difficult issues, and we don't really have an answer on how to resolve them. And I think human rights abuses and authoritarian practices taking place in some countries are actually used and have been used by extremist groups to recruit supporters and, also mobilize support, because repression, as we know, potentially breeds extremism. This is where the idea that the US and its allies, being complicit or accused of being complicit for failing to pressure allied countries in the region to redress human rights abuses must be taken into consideration. And again, as I've mentioned, these are very difficult issues that must be addressed to deal with the root causes of extremism. And finally, perhaps the idea that, to some extent, I would say, and I'm quite happy to say that we have improved our understanding of Islam and Muslim societies in Australia. The rhetoric of civilizational divide between us and them continues to be used by extremists, and this is something that we also have to address. The treatment of Muslims in France and elsewhere in Europe, the securitization of Islam and Muslims help fuel the perceived existence of this divide. So no matter how many imams we co-opt in the West and the Muslim world to combat jihadi ideology, these grievances are too real, too painful for some, and especially when coupled with other factors that I've mentioned earlier. And as long as these difficult and complex issues are not addressed in effective and meaningful ways, I would say that we can only hope to suppress violent extremism, but not tackle its root causes. That's my thoughts on the matter. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thanks, Raihan. I'd like to come back to you in a little on root causes versus ideology, I suppose, is perhaps something worth exploring a little further. Katja, for you, what are the sort of top of mind issues in terms of the counter-terrorism agenda? And you're on mute.
I muted myself as I was unmuting myself. So I'm going to go very meta, and instead of addressing a whole range of really important issues, which we definitely have to do, I'll say that we have to adjust our thinking. The minister rightfully said that we can look back on a successful journey on the road so far, that we have prevented mass casualty attacks. But there's a different game to be played because the adversary is not the same. And that sort of adaptation has already been taking place during the war on terror. But I would say we need a little bit more, and I would call that something that we need to get out of the sandpit in our heads, which doesn't just mean that we're stuck fighting wars over there in the desert of Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan. That has already been adapted, and the successful and robust, successful responses domestically in the robust structures we have in place, they're a testament to that. But I think there's a little bit more. We're now facing a very different enemy as well. We don't have, it was almost easy to face an enemy that was, we could fight over there. And it didn't come from our midst. Even when it was our own citizens that were being radicalized, it was still a foreign ideology that had nothing to do with our society and our values. But I think we're now we have to face the realization that it's a much more uncomfortable extremism. We've had 2 terror plots disrupted that came from neo-Nazis and white supremacists. And I think that's a very different game to play in our heads. And there's still a lot of the laws that were put in place, they can equally be applied. I believe that one of the extended sentencing was applied to a right-wing extremist. He wasn't in jail for that offense, but he was the order, it was extended based on the existing legislation. There's so much that can be applied, and there's research looking at this at the moment where it needs to be tweaked. So I don't think we have to worry about that so much. I would worry more about looking at the values that underpin our approaches, because policy is not made in a vacuum, and a lot of times the nuanced small details are really what matters, that we can't be comfortable and proceed with the playbook of an exotic enemy. We have to look at ourselves a little bit more, and we can go into detail what that means. That's just sort of as an overarching idea for that.
Okay, thank you. Roger, can you tell us a little bit about your current job as a counter-terrorism ambassador? I imagine you've spent more time than pretty much anyone else Zooming and talking to people online over the last little while. I mean, what do you see as being the essence of the job, and what would you like to be able to achieve with it during your posting?
Thanks, Peter. So yeah, I can verify the world is round because my Zoom timings are always 1 a.m. So, hey, I think, can I answer by starting? It's been a period of reflection the last couple of weeks. You know, we've got what's happened in Afghanistan plus 9/11 on the weekend. So to answer your question, we did a first principles look at what we should be doing. And we look back first, and we come up with 3 lessons that we think are the Australian lessons that are enduring from the last 20 years. First one is unity of effort is important. Partnerships matter. Teamwork is key. We think that's the big lesson first that we learn, and we should hold it. And then the second one is solutions are comprehensive and integrated. So everybody working together beats working alone. And that kind of mirrors, if you read the 9/11 Commission report, it talks about those things. And the final lesson, which sounds kind of obvious, but we think it's really important, is sharing information and lessons saves lives. And that we mean as widely as you possibly can. So there are what we think we've taken out the last 20 years to hold. And then looking ahead, there's a few things that we think will drive it as well. So the first one is the terrorists aren't going away. It's a persistent. So whether it be a modern iteration of Nazism in Australia or the changing nature of Islamist extremism or other new things, we're going to confront the problem of violent extremism. So we've got to think of it like that, an enduring protective effort rather than possibly than a war that we're going to win and will end. And then I think the next one is the world's changing really fast. So we've got to deal with it as it is, not as it was, and as it will be. So that took me to that earlier point about digitisation. So we've got to deal with this phenomena in a globally connected way. And then the last one, which the other two speakers, I think, rightfully went to as well, which is, hey, what about the root causes? What can we do about them to influence and stop or retard the spreading of violent extremism? So that's the frame. So what are we going to do about it? I think we've come up with 4 objectives which we're going to run. The first thing to say is it's not foreign affairs objectives, they're Australian objectives. Because of those lessons, we have an integrated approach as a nation. We've got a national strategy. It's probably the most integrated aspect of the national security space that you can find. And it's not just the government, so it's federal, state, local, but it's also a whole of society. So over the last 20 years, we've kind of pulled the big team Australia into the business. So my job, the first job we've got, is to make that strategy work offshore. So leveraging all of our partners and relationships to help Australia get where it wants to be, which means helping them get where they want to be. And if you want to look for a good thing out of the last 20 years in Afghanistan, for example, it's this tremendous network of international allies, partners and friends that we have. It's staggering, actually. So, for example, we've got about 20 MOUs with different nations specifically on counter-terrorism. All of the ones you'd expect and some you wouldn't. So helping us achieve the national objectives, helping the police, helping Home Affairs, helping civil society, the intelligence agencies maintain their really strong connections, number 1. Number 2 is deepen the network and then make the network fit for purpose. So what are our key relationships? What do we need to invest in? Can we get them focused on the things that we think are important? For example, countering online violent extremism. And then the third objective, which I think the other two speakers went to as well, is work with our partners and stakeholders to reduce the appeal, influence and effectiveness of terrorism and the appeal of violent extremism. So that is where that international network comes in to counter what is a set of global ideas and threats. And then the last one comes from that lesson of the last 20 years, keep sharing our lessons with our friends. So I can tell you from talking bilaterally, multilaterally, we all have pretty much the same set of issues and questions. We all have different threats, different contexts, different emphasis, but we all want to know how to stop the spread of violent extremism. How do you do a risk assessment on somebody who's a threat? What policies do you use for law enforcement? How do you manage de-radicalisation in prisons, for example? So we got to work with that global set of partners to share those lessons. And I can tell you, I'll just end with this. I've been very pleasantly surprised in this job about how interested everybody is in Australia and what Australians think and what Australians are doing to try and deal with these problems. And they're really keen to understand that. And we get value back from all of them from their experiences. So that's where we're headed, I hope.
Thanks, Roger. You spent so much of your professional career in the Middle East on these conflicts. We've had a lot of questions from our audience around the themes of, is Australia going to find itself back in Afghanistan someday? Does Afghanistan present a particular problem that will require us to readdress Afghan stability? Can you just offer some brief thoughts about those types of questions?
Yeah, he who makes predictions about Afghanistan is on icy ground. But I put it like this, from a counter-terrorism perspective, and if what's happening in Afghanistan and the Australian set of interests there is more than counter-terrorism. So, you know, for example, human rights, respect for women, girls, etc. They're all important interests. I'd say our primary interest with Afghanistan is pretty much similar to 2001. And to be brutally honest, it's about what threats emanate from that place that impact on Australia and its interests, which is not to say we're not interested in countering violent extremism, full stop, but what can reach out and hurt Australians, Australian interests, Australian partners, and then what comes out of there in the 21st century sense that impacts negatively on us all. And I think some of you might have heard the phrase victory narrative, which is the notion that, hey, we won, we fought for 20 years and violent extremism has won, whether it be connected to particular groups, or what we're finding is that neat lines between groups, Al-Qaeda or ISIS, are not so neat anymore. And so how do we counter that kind of cyber information thing? So I think we're in the business of assessment of our interests and really looking hard at trying to not allow another iteration of 9/11 or a 21st century, 2021 version of that, or a proliferation out of there that comes in other forms. So in its counter-terrorism sense, that's how I'd answer it. Now, here's what we've got to do. First question is, what's going on? What will happen? And be ahead of the curve, not behind the curve. And we're talking to all our partners about that.
Right. Raihan, I don't know if you want to buy into a discussion on Afghanistan situation, but I wanted to come back to your emphasis on sort of root causes, the sort of underpinning elements of the growth of extremism versus the power of the ideology of extremist groups, and how you kind of think about those two things. Are they connected? Are they separate? I noticed a really interesting question come up from a member of the audience to say there's a body of research which indicates that extreme misogynist views are a common theme underpinning violent extremist ideologies. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that you might like to share with us as well. And you're on mute. There we go.
Thank you so much for that question, Peter. So my research, I look at non-jihadi clerics and how non-jihadi clerics engage with jihadi ideology, but also try and correct misconceptions about Islam. And based on the research, it seems that you can talk about, jihadi ideology, trying to counter jihadi ideology, and you can produce great work. And I'm talking about religious institutions in the Muslim world producing brilliant, amazing work, comprehensive in engaging with jihadi ideology. And yet it's not really that effective in combating jihadi ideology. And this goes back to the idea that when it comes to jihadi ideology, it is often used as a supplement by jihadi groups to mobilize support and to kind of justify their existence and also their actions. So using Islam, using religious concepts or radicalized religious concepts to actually, provide some sense of legitimacy or create this idea that they're legitimate. So the idea is that I know some scholars, I don't work on radicalization, and I must say that, but scholars who work on radicalization, particularly in the Middle East, look at these root causes as problematic, particularly human rights abuses, as we mentioned earlier as well, looking at how the state engages in practices that would actually force people to reassess their options, and often they have no other options but to join jihadi groups. And I think these are complex issues that we need to talk about, must be addressed. And I know CVE programs are often directed to training imams, but even some imams would say that, yes, I talk to individuals who are very upset. They don't talk about jihadi ideology. very much. They use it as a justification, but often they talk about the frustration with US foreign policy, the short-term memory loss of policymakers when they engage in drone attacks, and you see, Pakistani children, used or treated as collateral damage rather than, apologizing properly and so on and so forth. So I think these are some of the issues that will continue to plague how we engage with terrorism and potential terrorist attacks or recruitment. But having said that, are we ready to address it? And what are we going to do to address it? And often we have policies that are, quite effective in preventing violent extremism, particularly massive scale attacks. But these are issues that are too difficult to address. And I think for us to move forward, perhaps that's something that we have to look at as well. I would say that, sorry, I was going to say something else, I can't remember.
We'll come back to you.
Yes.
Let me go to Katja now. A lot of Karen Andrews' speech was around, obviously, the domestic agenda. We now have this, I think I'm right in saying, first time meeting of police and counter-terrorism ministers domestically in a month or so's time. What's your take on the domestic agenda that needs to be pursued by government? And are we sort of adequately addressing those factors? What would you bring in perhaps and emphasise more that should be being looked at?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think one that we probably won't solve in the next 5 minutes or 5 days or even 5 months. I think it's related to what Raihan was saying about the root causes. It's quite interesting. So George W. Bush said some very intriguing things. I'm still trying to process them. Some of you might be aware how the memorial, he said, there's little cultural overlap between violent extremists abroad and violent extremists at home. But in their disdain for pluralism, in their disregard for human life, in their determination to defile national symbols, they are children of the same foul spirit. I thought that was really quite interesting. And some, it's a different debate whether that's hypocritical or not from the architect of the global war on terror. But I think what that points to is there are some similarities, and they're well established in the social sciences between the different forms of extremism. And for me, the most interesting thing here is that terrorists actually think they're engaging in critical thinking. They're engaging in a social critique. Some say that it's just nihilism and the violence has no purpose and it's just fanaticism from the dark ages, and that we need to combat that with enlightenment and education and critical thinking. But especially with this new threat that's forming, a lot of this is actually born out of some of the sort of the intellectual underpinnings or the ideology that drives right-wing extremism, the whole spectrum from the new right that is not openly advocating for violence to your Christchurch attacker, your sort of lone gunman that may be attached to some networks. What's behind that is this critique in a very violent form and unacceptable, obviously, of the current order and wanting to replace it with something else. And there is this element of we're critiquing what you're doing, and we're also giving them a lot of materials for that. Even just what bookends the global war on terror, what the images you can see in the media. We had people falling out of buildings on 9/11 out of the World Trade Center. And then the way this war ended was by people clinging onto an airplane, trying to leave Kabul. And if that wasn't enough, evoking images from Saigon, there's so much material there for terrorists to really spin that into some moral argument. Mm-hmm. And then if that wasn't enough, what really then ended the global war on terror was that drone attack, as it has now emerged, this New York Times investigation that they had lowered the threshold for the risk assessment, and they didn't need as much proof as they usually do that the people they killed were indeed the perpetrators and the terrorists, and they killed a family, about 10 people, 6 children. It was an Afghan man who was an aid worker, and he had applied for a protection visa for him and his family to the US. He'd looked to the US for protection. He got killed. And I think if we look at that, even if we're not trying to exploit that, that's really difficult. As Roger said, there are no easy answers, and often a complex environment also means there are differing interpretations that we have to navigate. So I think in terms of how we're going to translate that into effective policies, the awareness of it needs to also then extend to what constitutes a hate crime, because it's a new type of violence. We're not used to this. What actually constitutes terrorism is easier to define a little, but when we look at it domestically, violent extremism or extremism, what do we mean by that? I know some researchers here in Australia are doing some really good work on trying to get a database that can then be synced of this is what constitutes hate speech, this is what constitutes a hate crime, and this is what we will do about it. So there's a common standard. And so not one group doesn't feel like it's political correctness and it's wokeness and they're being censored. No, there's a unified definition. Some countries that have been dealing with this issue for longer, like Germany, for example, they're a little bit ahead in that, at least in the awareness of the problem. And the second point is also then in CVE initiatives that to match that diffusing threat landscape, they also need to diffuse in their orientation, that it's not a linear thing, that they're in Germany, for example, they're funded from so many different agencies because one size doesn't fit all. And then you're taking the state out of the equation even more. It's already the case that the state is just funding it, but not giving a whole lot of direction. But it's not just coming from one community who's now in charge of violent extremism and combating it. So you're creating these communities of suspicion. It's a much broader issue that goes right into the schools. It's more normalized, I would say, because they had to come to terms with this uncomfortable problem of extremism in their midst. So I think those are the kinds of nuances that make really good policy.
Well, there's so much to talk about, and we've come to the end, so we're not going to do that yet. I'd like to get all three of you back, actually. I think the intersection of Islamist extremism and far-right ideology, what we do about Afghanistan into the future, how we manage a better dispensation inside our own country with our communities. There's so many issues that should be explored. Roger, I was interested and intrigued by your emphasis in the online world and how we actually have to deal with that environment. For all three of you, please consider yourself on the hook to continue this conversation fairly soon at another time. But I'm afraid we have come to the end of our webinar today. For those of you who watched online and asked your questions, thank you very much. Do keep looking for the next ASPI webinar to join us with. To Karen Andrews, thank you very much to the Minister for her time, and to our three panellists. Thank you all for your time today. It's been a great pleasure talking to you all. And now we'll sign off at this point. See you at the next ASPI webinar. Bye for now.